In the Face of Terrorism, Protecting a Free Society. This is the third in a four-part series on terrorism. This program has been edited in sequence.
Our nation has known terrorism and violence throughout its history. In the pre-revolutionary years, the Sons of Liberty organized mob violence in Boston and other cities and intimidated Tories with the old American custom of tarring and feathering. We have known violence with a cause, from the nation's inceptions to the Civil War, to labor strife, to the civil rights struggles, and the anti-war rallies of the 1960s. But we have also seen senseless killing which horrified us all. Our nation was also founded on the inviolate principle that individual rights and freedoms under our Constitution in the Bill of Rights must be protected. Thus, when we are faced with the dilemma of protecting our society from violence, yet protecting the rights of violent terrorists, our system of justice is stretched to its outer limits. Watch now as these hard choices are played out in Protecting a Free Society. Our moderator is Charles Nesson of the Harvard Law School.
We're in Metropolis, which is a good-sized American city. Mr. Hallinan, you're a policeman, and you get a call from an informant that you've worked with before and who's always given you real good, solid information. He says to you, I think something is about to go down at the Metropolis airport. I think that there is about to be a terrorist attack or a terrorist bombing at the Metropolis airport. And I think it's going to happen Saturday. What do you do with that?
What is today?
Today is Thursday.
We would begin searching our files to see if there was any past activity on the part of this group.
He doesn't know what group it is. Say it's some Middle Eastern group. He doesn't know exactly what. Would you go to the airport and actually check things out there?
We would probably be very, well, subtle if, in fact, we would not try and create any type of panic or try to alert people to our activities at this particular time. It's more information.
You're going to sneak around the airport to see if there's anything happening.
We have a procedure with the airport personnel which would allow us to do discreet inspections of the area.
But you don't want to tell anybody about this.
That's correct.
You don't want to warn anybody.
That's correct.
Why don't you want to warn anybody?
Well,
I mean, here we got a possibility of the airport going up in smoke on Saturday afternoon, and you don't want to tell anybody.
Not at this point do I want to tell anybody.
What would it take for you to get really worried?
Well, if that bombing were to occur within 40 minutes to an hour after we received the phone call.
Ah, okay. If that's what it takes, now what?
Okay, in that case, we're going to, again, alert the people at the airport to begin their checks. We're going to get as many resources as we can into the area. Then we may go into disruption of traffic in some way so that the car traffic is not coming in, the pedestrian traffic may be shut down. We're going to try and do it in stages before we create this tremendous panic.
Mr. Jennings, you're a newsman. You get some information that the police are really worried about something happening at the airport. Is it news?
Yes, very much so.
Is it going to go in the air?
No, not right away, but we'll certainly dispatch crews very quickly to the airport and reporters to see what we can find out that's going on. We'll also call up the FBI, obviously, immediately, the New York police, the airport police. We'll put a sort of a network of folks out to try to find out what's going on.
Well, you're going to ask them what's going on.
Exactly.
Ask them. Let's
what's
see what
going on at the airport?
We are conducting an investigation at the airport.
What's the investigation?
I'm sorry, I can't comment on this.
How come you got so many cops out there?
Well, there's quite a number of people out there, so we figure we might have some problems with crowd control, so we're getting the necessary resources in place just in case we might need them.
I hang up pretty quickly because he's dry.
He's giving you nothing.
Not zero. Zero. I'm moving on to a better source. I'm immediately alert to the fact that something is happening of a much greater magnitude than normal because of the determination to keep people away from the airport, which speaks to public safety.
Yeah.
And because he's tried to close me out so hard.
Suppose that you've got, through your sources, information that the crucial time is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when it's supposed to happen. Are you going to sit there with your cameras and wait for it to happen? Or are you going to start warning people?
Well, the first thing, you asked me to think very fast. I wish to emphasize, you're asking me to think very fast here. One of my instincts will be to get to my management and myself to scream at every agency we can scream at to make the point that you have just made. If there is a question of public safety, you have a responsibility to somehow convey that to the public, for which we can be a vehicle.
I tell you, you have extremely good access to some extraordinary people on just that issue. In fact, you have the head of the FBI right here. Judge Webster, are you in favor of Mr. Hallahan notifying the public of this danger at the airport?
It's a judgment call.
Yeah, that's right. I want your judgment.
Now, all we have is the threat and a reliable source. These kinds of reports come in by the hundreds. You've got a balancing factor here that comes into play at this moment. Do you shut down the airport every time somebody picks up the phone and tips off somebody that something's going to happen? If he has no other information beyond that, and he's done everything he could to find presence of explosives or unusual circumstances, and I would rather imagine he would not close the airport down on that information.
Judge Webster,
but if he wanted to, I'd support him.
Am I right that they've never closed an airport down on this kind of information?
I suspect you probably are.
Never. In fact, you think that's pretty good judgment, don't you?
I do.
Now, Mr. Jennings, have that conversation. Judge Webster here.
Judge Webster, we are convinced now that the bomb which is going to go off, that there's going to be a bomb go off in 2 hours. Have you managed to locate where it's going to go off?
First place, I'm probably not talking to you.
That's perfectly true. So much for the anchorman's influence. I quite agree. I think that's true. You're going to ask me whether or not I'd go on the air and broadcast that we knew a bomb was going to go off.
Mr. Jennings, would you go on the air and broadcast the bomb would go off?
No, the answer was I wouldn't. I wouldn't. At this point, I think any reporter or any news agency is likely going to defer to the responsible government agencies at the federal and city level. And if it is not their call, I don't feel it's my public responsibility to make it my call.
At this point in time, all we know is that we have what we consider relatively credible information that a bomb may go off at 3 o'clock. Supporting that is all sorts of unusual activity being taken by authorities. Our calls to authority at various different levels essentially are ending up with stonewalling.
Right.
No one at any level has said, all right, look, we have such a situation here, we're going to take you into our confidence because we do not want you to print and we can make a good case why you should not print. Now, having not done that, they have left totally to our judgment what is in the public interest. And it seems to me if we take as credible that there is a bomb threat and there are activities being taken to respond to it, and no further information that we can get our hands on, yes, we run a story.
And if you were running a television operation where you had instant access,
I would probably break in to whatever show was on, and I think I would try and make the copy as judicious as possible. But I think it would be very difficult at that point to sit on what we would know because no one in positions to enlighten us further had done so or requested that we not act on the information that we had at hand.
Let's move ahead a jump. 3 o'clock comes, and there is a terrible explosion at the airport. It's not just where your guys were looking, but there is a big explosion at the airport. Now, Mr. Jennings, That's news, right?
Very much so.
Is it part of the news that the police knew about it beforehand?
Very much so.
Is it part of the news that they didn't warn anybody?
Yes.
Tell me how you're going to handle that.
Well, it will not be the initial cut of the story. First is the basic who, where, what, who, where, and why, right? Who and where and how many. And the why comes afterwards. I think the implicating, if you will, from our point of view, of the FBI and the New York authorities is secondary. We'll get to it, but we're not in a hurry to blame them. We're in a hurry to cover the basics of the story. Right. I would guess the main thrust of the story will be the why they didn't do it, the absolute key decision that made them decide not to do it.
Mr. Hogue, your enterprise, although you would have gone with it, didn't have the opportunity. But as you investigate the story, you learn that your competitor over here knew all about this beforehand, and that they made a choice at the highest levels of their operation not to go with this story. Is that part of your story?
I would think so. I think it would be in the context of who knew what when, which would involve the police and anyone else, in this instance, a rival member of the press. And we would report as much as we could find out, and that which we couldn't, we would probably list in a box of here are the unanswered questions.
And Mr. Jennings, when you report from your station, are you going to say, well, we knew about this, but we thought it wasn't worth telling you about either?
I will point out clearly that we knew about it in advance. I mean, that's my responsibility, is to say that we knew about it in advance. And I will couch it in the form in which we knew it, which, as I recall your scenario, was informed in highly qualified informants, and that we felt it our duty to defer to the federal and city authorities. We'll get hung for that, but I'm prepared to say that.
Mr. Clark, you're at the FBI, and you get a telephone call. And the telephone call says, Mr. Clark, I am a representative of the Liberanian Committee for Free Prisoners, a name you've never heard of before. And the person says to you, I want to communicate to you a private message. Our group was responsible for that bombing at the airport. We want one thing, and one thing only. You have, in your federal prisons, a man named Abdul, and we want him out. We only want one little thing. If we don't get it, there's going to be a wave of terror. If we do get it, it's all quiet. We're not going to embarrass you by letting anybody know that you've agreed to any terms with us. Be a secret deal.
I would certainly try to engage him in conversation to find out more about who he is.
Well, let's just say that's the call, and click, that's the end.
Well,
let's just say one more thing. He says to you, you may not think this is a credible call. I will tell you how credible it is. I will be in touch with you again. And if nothing has happened by next Thursday at 11 o'clock, then there will be another serious terrorist incident.
that message would be immediately communicated to the director and then to the intelligence community and the law enforcement entities that would have a responsibility, with the police department in Metropolis that we're working with.
Would you consider the proposition on the merits? That is, would you consider making a deal?
No, there would be no question in my mind that I would not make a deal, but I would...
Just no question?
I would, no question.
Senator Mathias, you're the senator from Metropolis, at least the state that includes Metropolis, and the Attorney General consults with you and says, say, I've gotten this proposition. You think we should do it?
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. That's the beginning of endless problems. Society at large has too big a stake. because society at large, not just Metropolis, not just my state, but the country and in fact the world, has a very large stake in this proposition. If we are going to deal in this kind of coin, if we're going to give up to terrorism, we're going to invite further terrorism. And I think that's the rule that we have to live by.
Mr. Jenkins, you've looked at a lot of terrorist stuff over the years. Is it true that you just don't deal with terrorists?
You always start with that position, yes.
They want something. They want something discreet. They want something small.
Well, now you've got one terribly important item. You have got their man in prison. And before you leap into concessions, you are going to attempt to open up the channel of communications. The only channel of communications you have right now that's potentially reliable is the guy in prison.
I'm not hearing an absolute position from you. We will not deal with the terrorists. We will not make any concessions to terrorists.
We will restate that. We will attempt as much as we can to adhere to that. And in the meantime, we will open up a line of communications. There's lots of things potentially, without yielding to the initial demands, that can be done.
What's the policy? Is the policy don't give the terrorists what they ask for?
The policy is to make no concessions to terrorists holding hostages.
That's the policy.
That's the policy statement.
Now tell us the reality statement.
Policy statement is like any other policy statement. People make policy statements about everything in the government over a period of years, and then they try their best to adhere to those policies. And most of the time, they do. But a policy is a guideline for action. It's not a law.
There's the deal right in front of you.
I've got a terrorist group on the loose in the United States. And the outcome, the satisfactory outcome, is not simply to release one prisoner, to defuse one campaign, but to get rid of something that is a great danger to public safety in this country. So I don't want to just solve this deal. I want to sort out a bigger problem. I got people running around with dynamite or explosives that are going to blow up other people. What's going to be the demand tomorrow or next week or the week from Tuesday?
They tell you they're going to go away. They're going to go back to Liberania, and that's going to be it.
Why should I believe them?
What's your choice?
You know, if you want to rush to the crunch point, then people will start thinking about what is palatable, or how do you make acceptable what is unpalatable. In the particular case of releasing people that have been charged with crimes from prison, that I would suspect, under the merits of the cases you give it, is going to be unacceptable, and that's going to remain so. And that means bombs are going to go off and people are going to die.
Mr. Kennedy, you're sitting in your office, and a man named Mohammed comes to see you. And he says to you, I'd like to retain you. I am a member of the Liberanian Committee for Freedom. And that group was involved in the episode at the airport. And we haven't been arrested or captured or anything as yet, but it may be that I will need some legal services and that other people will need some legal services. I'd like to retain you. Would you talk to me?
I would talk to you, yes.
Would you be my lawyer?
I'm not sure.
Talk to me.
I would want to find out what it is precisely that you apprehend your legal difficulties to be.
I think I may be arrested.
For what?
For being involved in a bombing at the airport.
And were you, in fact, involved in the bombing?
Can I ask me that right out? Yes, I was.
I admire your candor. I'm used to being lied to in the initial interview.
I mean, maybe you don't trust me because I told you right out.
I would then attempt to gather as much information, assuming I was willing to represent you, and for this purpose I would say yes. I would then try to gather as much information about you and your involvement as I possibly could.
Does it make any difference to you if I tell you that I'm not really so worried about the airport, because I don't think they're going to catch us on the airport. But there are some other actions that are coming up in the future, and you can't tell.
I would advise you that if you tell me that you plan future criminal activities, I'm telling you right now not to, because I will not consider those to be within our privileged area of communication, because I don't need to know that in order to defend you on the activities that happened in the past. So if you tell me, you run the risk of my telling the authorities.
So I shouldn't tell you?
That would be prudent, in my opinion.
Am I right that I just got a nice little lecture from you about how to talk to a lawyer?
Yes.
The idea is I don't tell you what I'm going to do, even though maybe I'm going to do it.
Unless you want to cause me to end our attorney-client relationship, unless you want me to be put into a position where I might become a witness against you, you ought not to be sharing information to me about prospective criminal activity.
Is it okay if we speak hypothetically about those things?
I don't see any value in that, but I suppose we could engage in that exercise.
Mr. Kennedy, Thursday comes along, and there is an explosion in a department store downtown. Does that bother you at all?
Of course.
Would it bother you more if Mohammed had hypothetically talked to you about that?
Yes.
Would it bother you enough to spill the beans on Mohammed?
I don't know. I don't know. My responsibilities as a lawyer, not only to this particular client, but to the principle of an attorney-client relationship and its openness. Otherwise, we can't, as lawyers, do our job. You have placed that in tension with my responsibility as the responsibility of any other citizen, not necessarily to become a police officer or an informant, but we are all responsible in a democratic society for law enforcement. When those two come into tension, as you have placed them, what I end up doing affirmatively, I'm not sure. I could, I suppose, say to Mohammed that, so far as I'm concerned, our relationship is over and do no more. I could, on the other hand, go to the authorities and become a witness against my client. That is something that I find very unlikely that I would do.
But now, if I understood you right, you didn't really have any compunctions about taking the case in the first place, even though Mohammed is a very bad person, engaged in very bad things.
No,
I mean, in a sense, you are going to become the legal representative of a terrorist organization, in a sense.
Whenever we talk about terrorism, the first things that we begin to forget about are our democratic institutions that we need to protect. So right away, the rights of people begin to be dissipated, and that is of great concern to me. My responsibility to Mr. Mohammed is to make certain that the state that is attempting to take away his liberty does it by our rules and doesn't violate our rules, because if the state violates our rules in attacking a particular pariah or targeted defendant, the state itself is diminished and the rights of everyone are reduced.
Now, let me suppose with you that Mr. Mohammed has talked to you in the first instance and has told you about his involvement in the airport, and that he talks to you a second time and tells you of his involvement in the department store.
After it has happened.
After it's happened.
Yes.
And he talks to you perhaps a third time and tells you about his involvement in the bus station. Does the
After it
has
happened.
That's the line that's important, after it's happened? There comes no point at which you say, this is too rotten, this is too threatening to what America is about for me to be devoting my energies as a lawyer to defending him.
No, it crossed the threshold of palatability to me, if that's important, when I learned that he had committed the offense in the first place. That he has committed additional offenses since then, I am powerless under my obligations to do anything about. And that's why the distinction between prospective criminal activity, there's something planned for the future, and that which has already occurred is a very important one.
Let us imagine that there have been a series of bombings, and that in fact we have a blitz of sorts. And then the following episode happens. Senator Mathias, you're in town, and your daughter, let's imagine a 14-year-old daughter, is going to be participating in a choir that's singing at a fundraiser. The fundraiser is to take place in a restaurant that's on the top of a building, a 10-story building in town. And the choir's rehearsing in the morning. And you think it'd be nice to stop by, and while you're up at the rehearsal, security people who are with you discover 4 men in a stairwell, apparently doing something having to do with setting some bombs. There's a shot, various people run, and you find yourself in the restaurant. Yourself, the person directing the choir, 16 or so young people in the group, with 4 terrorists. All right, there's our set, all right?
Not all right, but there it is.
There it is. Mr. Gates, you get word of this. Security guy runs down, notifies police. He tells you they've got a lot of automatic weapons, a lot of explosives.
Well, the first thing you're going to do is begin a normal operation of dealing with terrorists who have hostages.
What is the normal operation? Who's in charge of this operation?
Normal operation is to close off the area.
Is the FBI involved in this at all?
No.
This is just local?
Local.
Should the FBI be involved in this kind of thing?
I think we certainly would be asking the FBI if they have any information on who these people might be. Certainly we would ask them for that kind of information.
Mr. Jennings, be a reporter for me. You hear about this event happening down at a building in town. Do you want to get there?
Not automatically. I'm first of all thinking actually what Mr. Jenkins might be saying, because he would regard this as a force multiplier. Am I correct, Mr. Jenkins? Chief Gates is really on the stick now, because Senator Mathias makes an enormous difference to him, and it makes an enormous difference to the story. Senior Senator of the United States has now been taken hostage, perhaps his daughter. However we may wish to feel about all humans being equal, it ain't the case in a hostage situation. So everything has increased. The pressure's increased all the way across the board. If I go to the story, again, it depends somewhat on what role I'm playing here. If I go to the story directly, I become, by and large, an observer to something that I anticipate, having been through this before, is going to be an immobile situation. The building is going to sit there for a while. I'm not going to see too much. But if I'm assigned to cover the stakeout, fine, that's where I will spend the next... I once spent almost 18 hours staring at a building in Munich in 1972. Staring at a building, that's all I did, and that's what you do on the stakeout. If I'm doing the political dimension of it...
That's not the job that you're looking for there.
Well, no, on the contrary. I mean, it depends what you get assigned to. I mean, you may have to collate all the coverage, which is often what the anchor person is required to do. You may be on the stakeout. You may be covering the political dimension. You may be worrying about Chief Gates' political future. I mean, everything has just gone up. I cannot explain to you how forcefully everything has just jumped 10 political stories.
Because Mathias is up there.
Absolutely.
Mr. Nelson, there's buildings right across the street from this building, and Chief Gates is out there trying to shut things off. But he hasn't shut everything off yet. Any interest in getting up in one of those buildings and being able to look through the windows?
Sure.
See what's going on?
Sure. If you're the on-the-scene reporter.
The chief is out there with a bullhorn you're trying to keep those guys away from there, aren't you?
Do our best. Do our very best to keep them away.
And you understand that.
Sure.
But that doesn't slow you up?
No, not.
Well, why wouldn't you want to cooperate with the chief here? I mean, he clearly has a job.
I don't see where it's going to cause any harm for a reporter to be over in another building looking over, trying to get the information. If I saw it as really interfering with it, I might have some second thoughts about it, but I wouldn't see that as interference.
You don't see that as interference either, then, do you, Chief?
Well, I would think it really depends on where they were and what they could observe. It could be interference, and we'd have to make a judgment. We recognize the need of the media to gather information. We would provide a location for them, and we would give information to them as quickly as we could.
Mr. Nelson, would you think about calling in to the restaurant? You could look up a number.
Oh,
There
sure.
it is.
Sure.
Rooftop restaurant.
Yeah, we would do that.
Just call in, see who picks up.
Yeah, and ask them questions about what was going on in there.
Chief, you got any problem with that?
Oh, great problems with that. Yes.
What's your problem with that?
Well, first thing we're going to attempt to do is establish some kind of communications with the terrorists, and we certainly don't want the lines tied up. We would do everything in our power to cut off all of the lines coming out, and it's kind of difficult today to do that, but we do our best to do that.
Mr. Jennings, you agree with Mr. Nelson? Just call him up?
I have a personal problem with that, yes. I think that...
What's your problem?
Because I'm aware that you run the risk of having a multitude of negotiators. I'd like to know what they're thinking. I'd like to know what's going on. I'd like to know how the kids are. I certainly would love to talk to the senator.
That would be great
I hope
stuff,
it's
wouldn't it?
it would be terrific. I hope it's not my call in some respects, because I'm very aware that the situation is less likely to be resolved if there are a multitude